Welcome to DIYeasycrafts and BergKnifemaking.com. Today we're going to pick up where we left off in tutorial part 2, and we're going to finish the build. In part 2, we ground the knife bevels and started on the handles, basically got the blank ready for heat treating. On this video, we're going to pick up the project after heat treating. Now this particular knife is AEBL stainless steel. So it was heat treated in a heat treating oven, plate quenched, sub-zero quenched, and also tempered. And that's all done according to the type of steel that you're going to use for your knife. So we're going to start by cleaning up the post-heat treat bevels. I'm going to put the tilt table back onto my 2x72 grinder. This is a Origin blade maker, 2 horsepower, variable speed. The angle has already been set. I did not change the angle since I ground the bevels prior to heat treating. So the cleanup is relatively simple. I used an 80 grit prior to heat treating. I'm going to use a 120 grit belt to clean them up. 1 or 2 passes usually cleans up the majority of the bevel. Especially when you're using stainless steel and plate quenching, you don't have nearly as much warpage as you do with oil quenching. Now, if you see any little blemishes, any little scratch marks, or deeper grind lines from the coarser grit paper that we used to originally establish the bevels, you can spend a few more minutes on that particular area. And I'm just going to clean up the plunge line. I've got this belt hanging over the right side of the flat platen, so it gives it a nice rounded over plunge. And that's one side cleaned up. I'll do the exact same thing on the other side. Now this particular blade, I electro-etched the blade surface just to give it a crinkle appearance. I kind of like texture on my blades. If I had not done that, you could surface grind the flat surfaces of the blade to clean them up. But I don't want to use that, I don't want to lose that crinkled effect obtained through electro etching. So what I'm going to use is I'm going to go back to the 2x72 grinder, but this time instead of putting a belt on it that has sandpaper, this is one of those Scotch-Brite belts. And I'm just going to lightly clean the surface. Really doesn't take much. A handled magnet makes doing this very easy. And this is basically how I was originally going to leave the knife. You know, I kind of like those horizontal grind lines. I usually take them to, 120 or 240. And with the crinkled effect, I think that looks really nice. I did change my mind on this particular project. But let's start on the handles, and then I'll show you what I did. So recently I started making these segmented or hybrid handles. So I had quite a few to choose from. I picked this one that has a combination of both dark and light woods. The light is a nice burl, and I just think it's going to give it a nice, classy look to this particular blade. Now these are going to be removable scales, so they're not going to be pinned with glue. I'm going to drill 1/4-inch holes through each pinhole. I'm going to use the blank as my drill guide. I'm going to line up the blank exactly where I want it on the first half of the scales, and I'm going to drill a hole. Then in order to hold that location, I'm going to use one of the threaded inserts that we'll later use to secure the scales to the blank. And that's just going to hold the location of that first hole. Then I'm going to move up and I'm going to drill my next hole through the first half of the scales. Now notice I have a big C-clamp clamped onto my drill press. That's to prevent that blade from helicoptering and spinning in case the drill bit does get caught. Once the holes are drilled in the first half, now you have to transfer them onto the second half. And with the segmented scales, it's really important to get those segments, the liners, the spacers, lined up perfectly on both the front or the top and the bottom of the scales. So what I do is I put my drill through the first hole, line up everything visually, and once I visually have all of those spaces, top and bottom lined up perfectly, then I'll clamp that into position. You really don't want the drill bit to even touch the hole on the first side. You just want it to drill through the bottom. I do have a piece of wood underneath that. That's going to prevent any blowout. I'm going to use that same threaded riser to hold my position of this hole now. And now I'm going to position the back hole. Again, I'm going to put the drill bit right through that top scale, which has the 3 holes in it, lock it into position. Then I'm going to take my time and make sure that those liners are perfectly lined up visually on both the top and the bottom of the scales. And once I'm satisfied with that, I'll again clamp these into position or into location, and then I'll be able to finish drilling the hole. It's really the first 2 holes that are tricky. I'm going to use that same, or another threaded insert to hold the position of the 3rd hole. Once you have 2 of those threaded inserts in position, those scales aren't going to move. Drilling the 3rd hole is very easy. This is a 1/4 inch bit, and I'm also using 1/4 inch outside diameter threaded inserts. And it seems like a little bit of work, but these are actually easier to put together than drilling and pinning. They go together faster. You don't have the dry time for the epoxy. So I'm going to set the depth on my next drill bit, and the size of this bit is going to depend on the outside diameter of the cap screws that you're going to use. You want to use a drill that's slightly larger than the outside diameter of the cap screw. And you want to set the depth so that the drill does not go all the way through the scale material. You want to leave a little lip at the bottom of the hole, and that's what the cap on the cap screw is going to sit on. You'll see in a second. Now as I take the scale away from the drill press, look into each hole. You see how there's a little lip down towards the bottom? That's what the flat side of the cap screw is going to rest on. So assembling the scales, and during the process of making scales, you're going to take these on and off quite a few times. That threaded insert will actually stick through both sides of the tang of the knife, or through the blank. Now I use the same cap screws over and over during the building process, and then when I'm all done, I'll get rid of those and I'll put new ones in. So that the final product, the final knife, will have nice, clean, black cap screws, whereas these I may have scruffed up a little bit with the belt sander, or certainly got them dirty and dusty and everything else. With both scales now held onto the blank with those threaded risers and cap screws, I'm just back on the belt grinder, coarse grit belt, and I'm going to profile the scales, which means I'm just going to use that coarse grit belt to bring the scales into size. And this is actually a very fast process. It really doesn't take long. You want to grind the scales until they match the blank, or match the metal in the blank. So you're going to end up with exposed steel, and you're going to end up with horizontal grind lines around the whole profile of the handle. I can let that belt hang over one side of the flat platen, and that allows me to rough out even the finger groove. And now you can get a really kind of a good idea of what the finished product is going to look like, especially with the segmented or hybrid scales. The next step, I'm going to use a 80 grit paper. I'm going to go horizontal on the 2x72, and I'm going to get rid of all of those, we're going to go vertical on the 2x72 and get rid of all of the horizontal grind lines. And then you can finish the sanding off with whatever grit you'd like. You know, a lot of people take them to 120 or 240, or you could take it right down to a mirror finish if you wanted. I'm going to use a small wheel attachment just to get into that finger groove. I did an 80 and a 120, and then I think I did a 240. And then I actually start to shape my scales right on the 2x72. It really is a very versatile machine. I'm back with a 80 grit paper. A lot of people don't do it this way. You have to be really careful not to touch the blade to the sandpaper or the belt at all. You can actually ruin the project very quickly. But if you're careful, it's a very quick way of rounding over all of the corners on the scales. I usually just do this with an 80 grit paper. And then I can use the bottom contact wheel on the bottom of that flat platen to start to shape the inner curves. And again, I'm just roughing it here. It doesn't have to be precise. You want to be really careful not to take too much material. You can't put it back on. And this is what you end up with right off of the belt grind. So I now use a hand sander, an oscillating sander, and I'm going to use an 80 grit and then a 220. And then after the 220, I'll hand sand, and I'll hand sand with a 500 and then also a 1000 grit. Just rounding over all the edges, smoothing out, any of the high spots. And then I like to use the 2x72 to start buffing the scales. I use a buffing belt with compound, and this really buffs and polishes the scales very nicely. I will go over to a buffing wheel on a standalone buffing wheel with some compound, but I get the majority of it done on the 2x72. Now at this point, I changed my mind as to what finish I wanted on the blade itself. So I'm going back to the 2x72. This is a 240 grit. I'm going to do this by hand, and what I'm doing is I'm just pressing that bevel flat against the flat platen. The bevel is already established. It's been established with the tilt table. I've slowed down the RPMs to 30 or 25%, and I'm really just going to try to polish out some of those horizontal grind lines. Now, what I want to end up with is almost a mirror finish, but not quite. I want to leave just remnants of those horizontal grind lines, and then I'm going to dip this in acid and give the whole thing kind of a dark look. This is now a 2000 grit paper, and again, I'm just going back and forth. I'm hand holding it. I'm just pressing the pre-established bevel angle flat against that flat platen, and the RPMs are down. I'm not really grinding the bevel at this point. All I'm doing is polishing. Now you could take this as far as you wanted. this is as far as I wanted to go. So I can see myself, but if you look real close, you can still see in the right light some horizontal grind lines. And that's really just kind of the effect that I was looking for. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to dip it into ferric chloride acid. Now I've got my acid container. It's just a piece of PVC pipe with a cap on one end and a threaded cap on the other. I've got it resting over a 5-gallon bucket so that if I get any spillage at all, it's going to go into the bucket. And I can also use that bucket after the blade has been etched to neutralize. So I left the blade in the ferric chloride for about 5 minutes. Clean off all the acid, neutralize, etc. And this is basically the look that I was going for. It's a darker blade. You can still see the electro-etched blade surface. You can still, if you look real close, see some of the horizontal grind lines. And I just think that's going to look real nice with the color combination of these scales. Now, assemblies of the scales is very easy. The threaded inserts, which are aluminum, I said before, 1/4 inch outside diameter. These are 832 threads. I did a whole show on removable scales. I'll post a link on this video for that particular episode. And on that one, I even listed the part numbers. I got these from McMaster Carr. Once it's all done, a few images of the finished product. So this is an AEBL stainless steel knife. It's got hybrid or segmented scales, removable handles. It's got electro-etched blade, and it's been also acid-etched to give it a little bit of darkness. I hope you enjoyed this little mini-series, this 3-part tutorial. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and by all means, leave a comment. I'd like to invite you to our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making, where you can post images of your own builds. And by all means, check out the book that Jason Northgard and I put out last year called Introduction to Knife Making, available on Amazon.com. Thank you very much.